She's terrified of police officers.
You want to take your jacket off because you're hot?
Are you hot? She won't talk. She's dead.
Oh, she is?
I can't even conceive of not being able to hear and not being able to talk in Florida State Prison. If I were a prosecutor, I could make a compelling argument why Michelle should go back to prison.
My name is Pat Murray. I'm with the Trauma Research Foundation. I'm just be hosting the Q&A today for Dean Michelle. And we have a panel of guests here. I'm going to briefly introduce everybody, and then I'm going to let everyone sort of tell us in their own words who they are, why they're here, and if they want to make any comments on the phone, they're welcome to as well. So first, we have May Thornton Mehra. She was the filmmaker and producer of Dean Michelle. We have Dr. Gabriel Lomas. He's professor of counseling and advisor to Dean Michelle. We have Noelle King. She's a mental health clinician and art therapist. And then we have Dr. Makoto Iwagami. He's a licensed clinical social worker. And then we have Rory. She's going to be interpreting on screen for us in ASL. And behind the scenes, we have Suzanne, and she's going to be speaking what's being signed for everybody. So let's start out. Second, Gabe, can you just speak briefly about trauma and deaf people and explain how Michelle is not unique in her situation?
Yeah, thanks, Pat, for the question. The film, I think, just does a fabulous job of putting together different segments of Michelle's life. And if your viewers think back to when she was young, you can see that there were adverse childhood experiences when she was a little girl. And those, I think your audience is generally well trained on ACEs, and if they think about some of the factors that she experienced, that it was just one thing after another. And so she went from an abusive situation into the foster care system, and then continued to have difficulties at school. And then she ended up with her first arrest, and that was sort of this domino effect of being thrust into the school to prison pipeline. So researchers in the field tend to call it more of a nexus, because it's not just one thing that pushes you, but multiple things that push a person into that pipeline. So for her, you see that she didn't really have good interventions that were, supportive. She had a poor environment. She had abusive, parents. And then the treatments that were given to her were not, appropriate and helpful treatments for her. So, and those are that's just scratching the surface. So there's quite a bit there that we can dissect, that will point to the expansion really of the trauma that she experienced.
Okay, thank you, Gabe. I'm going to jump over to Makoto next. And can you just speak about the deaf specific trauma resources or lack of resources that are around the country?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I watched the film Being Michelle, and it was heartbreaking. I noticed several items. The lack of mental health services for deaf people, for one. She's not the only one. There are many, many deaf people who have been put through this system and don't receive culturally appropriate services. For example, residential programs, support, advocacy, psychiatric services, the list could go on. Hearing people can access all sorts of services 24/7 every day. They can go to the hospital. They don't need to request an interpreter for access. They just go about their normal requests or for services. But for deaf people, it's not the same. When they go to the hospital, they need to request an interpreter, but can be frustrated by a denial of services or not having interpreters for their treatment, psychiatric treatment, and that can cause a bit of trauma. I watched the film, and also people think that with deaf or family members who are addicted, what have you, that can cause trauma, but not necessarily. Society doesn't offer culturally linguistic services, and that can make the trauma even worse. For deaf people, they don't cause the trauma. We, meaning we must take on the responsibility to develop and fight for more mental health services specializing in deafness, so that deaf people don't have to be traumatized in the mental health system facilities, prison facilities, correctional facilities. With everyone, your audience and the team together, we need to consider how we can establish and encourage the development of mental health services for deaf individuals.
Can I just follow up, just because I don't understand this world? This is new to me, this world. What is an expectation, or what is a common way things are for someone who's deaf to go to a hospital? How many people do they generally have on staff to help somebody? Or how many, like in any other facilities, like what is the expectation? Are they understaffed? What is the situation?
Well, for example, if a deaf person goes to the hospital and there's a deaf patient there, or maybe there may be one or two, most likely one deaf patient amongst all the hearing patients. It depends on where they live, if it's urban or rural. But most of the time, if a deaf person goes to a hospital and they, can maybe see a nurse or a social worker or the front desk, when they encounter that deaf patient, they don't know what to do. They're kind of at a loss. They see, the same with police anywhere in the world. It's very sad. It's run by hearing people. So to go to a facility, often, I'm sure, Noel will talk more about this later, but often deaf people like myself, yourself, we are self-advocates. We can ask for an interpreter, but often we can request it, but an interpreter may not be qualified. If I go to as a patient, I can advocate for myself and request a qualified, certified interpreter. Those deaf patients who don't have advocacy skills may not be able to advocate for themselves, and they may be misdiagnosed, given the wrong treatment. That's an added trauma to the trauma they've already experienced. They may need a doctor who knows how to interact with deaf patients, to have the appropriate interpreter for them, so that they can heal. A hospital is a place where patients are supposed to be able to heal, but the deaf patients experience, sometimes that's the opposite thing that happens. What do you think, Gabe, Noel? This is Noel speaking. I agree with what Makoto just said. Imagine going to the hospital and not, nobody speaks the same language as you. They speak another language, sometimes Spanish, maybe an English interpreter is there. Sometimes, a deaf person comes in and there's no interpreter. If they request an interpreter, the professionals say, well, bring your own interpreter. And they say, maybe they will use a video relay service, or VRI, where it doesn't connect well. There may be Wi-Fi problems, or there's a communication lack. There has to be deaf people who grow up often speaking, but there's a communication barrier. So it's quite a challenge that deaf patients face often. Some can read and write. There are others who prefer to have an interpreter to fully understand accurate communication in the hospital. It's not just the hospital, it's other places. Again, we need to remember that the deaf community is very diverse. Some prefer interpreters, some prefer to write to their professionals. Oh, Michelle had if she would to have had an interpreter, she would have had to have a hearing interpreter as well as a certified deaf interpreter to be able to accurately communicate what she understood and said.
Thank you. Gabe, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I mean, really what they said was spot on, and I think just a way that I like to help hearing people make sense of that is if it's almost like being in a different country. Like if you went and and you had a crisis and you were in a foreign country and you needed help, you'd want that help to be done in your native language, and having an interpreter there may help you make some sense of it, but it's not culturally affirmative. It doesn't really truly meet your needs. And to top it off, psychotherapy, counseling, psychological services, they're so sensitive, to really connect with another person at that level really requires a culturally affirmative, viewpoint. And those are hard to find. Those are really difficult to find. In some urban areas, you have deaf professionals, you have ASL fluent hearing professionals, but it's very rare to find the entire continuum of services available all across the nation. It's very challenging, to provide those services. And you think about what Michelle went through. We've got these psychiatric issues, but then she's got all these other related services. You've got Child Protective Services in Florida. You've got law enforcement, and you saw their attorneys. And I mean, there's just quite an array of services that all contribute to her treatment and her recovery. And when the system's not working, for most deaf people, the system just doesn't work. And so you end up with this situation where, you've got this pipeline of a person who really doesn't get the treatment that they need when they're younger and ends up in this disaster kind of situation.
Well, thank you, Gabe. I just want to follow up with Noelle as well. Can you speak about art therapy as trauma treatment? From what we saw in the film, it clearly is working for Michelle. I don't know if it's through a clinician or through anybody, but just naturally works. Can you tell us about that?
It seems the point of being Michelle in the film, she chose art as her expressive, how to express herself. She uses art. I'm an art therapist, but she uses art therapy as a visual tool to express her feelings, her thoughts, because she, as a deaf person, communicates in American Sign Language. So, and then her language was deprived from her when she was very young. So sometimes one word may be hard to describe, it's hard to express herself. So she does that through art. And you can see her feelings in her art. She did a great job doing that. Her experience, her personal experiences, her trauma experiences. I'm wondering, if this is a healing process for her. She's very brave and courageous to show these paintings in this film. That's why art is so important. It's a healing process. You can't have healing without pictures. You can't suppress them. It must be expressed.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. I'm going to move on to May now. May, can you just tell us how you learned about Michelle and talk a little bit about why you decided to make this film?
Yes, so my husband and I have been working on documentary films together since 2009. We just so happened to meet Michelle by chance. An executive producer on the film introduced us to Kim. And in my husband's first trip to Florida was during one of the times that Michelle first ran away while we were there. And Natin caught that whole experience on film and with the camera. And as we sat down with Michelle and just started learning a little bit about her story, we just knew that we had to collaborate with her and bring her story to the world. And, it was a couple, the whole process, it's been about 5 years now since we first met Michelle. We met her when she was a year out of prison living with Kim and Bob. But it's just been an amazing healing process to work with her through this. We didn't know what was going to happen with the case while we were filming. It was real, pretty challenging situation. But it's just been an amazing experience. And as we got a few years in, we came to realize that Michelle's story is Michelle's story, but it also represents the experience of many people. We had no idea. So it's been an incredible learning process for us. We have a really strong team of deaf and hearing advocates that we're all working together to bring this story out to the world, because not only do each of us as individual human beings have so much to learn from Michelle and her healing process, but there's so much for all of us in society as hearing individuals to learn about what the deaf experience is and can be in our society, and we believe globally. So we're thrilled to be here.
Follow up to that too. How were you able to film those scenes in prison, and what were some of the challenges with filming those parts of the movie and other things that maybe that we don't understand as the viewer?
Yeah, so we usually start out with our films with kind of sit down long form interviews. I like to think of it as more of an oral history interview where you just sit and use deep listening to hear about someone's experience. In doing so, we learned about all of these different things that Michelle had been through. And then we were able to, dive back into those at later points in time. And she took us to the places where some of these things happened to her. She started painting the experiences, so it really was this very collaborative process. But I'll tell you that in the beginning, she kind of didn't really understand why Tin wanted to record her story or film it. And so he did a little, and then he'd edit a little, and then he'd show her. And as soon as it clicked in her head and she understood what he was doing, she started directing him and telling him, no, Tin, you need to do it like this, and let's do this. And specifically, one of the reenactment scenes in the prison, we rented a prison in Jacksonville that's no longer in use. And Tin told Michelle the plan was to get an actress and we'd film her from the head down. We didn't want to make Michelle re-experience being inside a prison or being handcuffed or any of that thing. And she looked at Tin and she said, Tin, this is my story and I'm going to show the world what they did to me. So that was her decision to be a part of that part.
I was wondering that exact same question while watching it. So that's nice to hear that was voluntary. And
absolutely.
So that's great. Gabe, I just want to ask you, I hear that you do some research about the school to prison pipeline for deaf individuals. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. I'll try to summarize it in a nutshell because I've given 6 and 8 hour seminars on the topic. So I think that there is research for kids who are minority kids, people of color already on this topic. And what I did was just parallel it to the experience of deaf and hard of hearing people. So, for example, Noelle commented about language deprivation, about how deaf children, just don't have the same exposure to language, and so that really puts them at a disadvantage when they're trying to navigate their world. And the reality is that you and I, people who are hearing, sometimes intentionally unplug from the world because we have too much information, and we know that mindfulness and periods of calm are really important for our own mental health. And yet deaf children often have the opposite, situation. They just don't get enough information, especially when, they're in a hearing family. The family, may or may not, communicate with them. And you can see in Michelle's situation, she didn't have any parental communication, and in foster care, the foster care families, didn't have that communication. So I think that, there's quite a number of reasons why, kids do end up sort of, in that thrust into the pipeline. But for deaf kids, clearly that lack of language when they're young is a key factor. And of course, kids with adverse childhood experiences, And then I do a lot of evaluation. I've done thousands of evaluations. And one of the things that I see a lot is cognitive functioning also impacts it. So kids who are higher functioning, who have strong cognitive functioning, can often, navigate these waters. And the kids who are very, very low, it's very obvious to law enforcement and to other providers. But those kids that are sandwiched in between, those kids are really at the most risk, in my opinion, because they can be perceived as kids who just have deafness when really they've got disabilities, that impair their functioning, and those kinds of kids end up, getting thrust into the system. And then when you couple that with like zero tolerance policies, which research is showing are problematic, and we're seeing those on the decline, but there's still it's typically at school by school for them to make those decisions. So I still run into schools in progressive communities where they still have zero tolerance policies. So, zero tolerance policies for, if the audience is not aware, those usually give you harsh consequences without any kind of consideration for the context. So like, for example, if a person has drugs or alcohol on campus, it may be an automatic expulsion and referral to the juvenile justice system, when there's really not any explanation of why that person might have that with them and what they were doing. So like if you see in Michelle's case, there's a lot of misunderstanding, around her. She doesn't really understand her environment. She just tries to go along with it. So in cases like that, zero tolerance policies are only going to continue to push kids through that system. So you can see I'm passionate about that. I could go on and on and on, but I think I've kind of given you a little touch on that, how deaf kids get pushed into that system.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to follow up with Noelle, because it seems like she has something to add to this about sort of language deprivation and how that ties into what Pete was talking about.
Yes. So definitely, Makoto talked about language deprivation within deaf children, and often that experience, I would say 96% are deaf children born to hearing parents. So with that percentage, hearing parents, about 25% learn sign language out of that 95%. So language access is not there. So you see the background, incidental learning is lacking for the deaf child. They miss interactions, they miss what can be discussed in the background. Hearing children get that information from their parents, internet, TV. And deaf children have to navigate through life without that information. If there's a deaf plus person, 90% in the general population of disabled people, and meaning deaf plus children, there's a higher chance that they would experience that lack of information, lack of incidental learning, without any sign language, without any language. They're language deprived. And that's how we live, not just in schools, but in shelters, in foster care, all these different places. And it can be so frustrating and definitely traumatic. It's an awful cycle. Michelle was not the only one experienced that, but it can be experienced within the deaf community. Lack of mental health services, language deprivation can really exacerbate the issues that deaf people experience while they're growing up.
Yeah, thank you, Mom. Makoto, I want to just ask you, can you tell us a little bit about why we don't have more deaf clinicians?
I wish I had a miracle thought that there would be a miracle to have more deaf clinicians. The deaf numbers are small in proportion to professionals, and those are small too. But going back to when we were talking about language deprivation, there is not really a spectrum. As far as myself, I went into college I can write well. I was not really equivalent to a writer, like a hearing person. As Noelle mentioned, growing up, I'm from a family who's hearing, and they can sign pretty well, but I missed a lot of family discussions or being out in the world. Noelle explained it perfectly. Imagine having limited language and then going into college like myself. The percentage of success would lower. Hearing people can go into college and get the information, but as a clinician in graduate school, the numbers are very small compared to hearing clinicians, as well as the tests being in English, and that's not my first language. People in graduate school it's very difficult to pass the tests because they're in English. There are accommodations like interpreting them into American Sign Language, maybe extended time, but it still is, there is still a struggle. So I hope, I do have, there's some universities, Gallaudet universities, Rochester Institute of Technology, that do offer psychology and social work programs. And I'm hoping other hearing universities would consider seeing this film and realize that we need to increase the numbers of professional mental health services, and that universities would be glad to collaborate with Gallaudet or collaborate with local deaf agencies in order to establish programs in order to train more students to become mental health professionals in order to serve the deaf community in the near future. Noelle? If I could add, not only that, clinicians who are deaf are very limited. You have graduation and a degree, but you have to be supervised and get someone to supervise you for a number of hours. So it's hard to find a supervisor who knows sign, who will be able to communicate with the intern, and there are so many barriers there. So it goes back to the problem of language access.
I just want to mention that my husband grew up in northern India, and he came here about 15 years ago after we got married. But in India, you can still watch the news, and there is a sign language interpreter on the news. Here in the United States, we are still lacking that most basic accessibility. So as a society in general, we are so hearing-centric, English-centric. It's mind-boggling that we don't think about people who speak different languages, including deaf people who use American Sign Language to communicate. It's just like we've got to get out of this dense hearing mode of thinking that English and being hearing is the only way to exist in the world, especially here in the United States.
That sort of brings me to another question. I was going to just pose it to May, but I'd like to hear everybody sort of chime in on it. What hope, do you have the impact, or what hope do you think the impact of the film could be on society? And I if you can give me something more specific than just a big answer, like one thing to drill down on that would make a huge change, I'd love to hear it.
Let you all go first.
Gabe, you want to start?
It's hard to give, one thing because there's so many things, Pat. But I think, I think every professional in these areas can make a difference. So, for example, we could see changes in schools, where deaf children get more exposure to understanding their rights, and and they could become better advocates. And, we can see, I think it would be powerful to see, changes in law enforcement. I mean, that to me is one of the biggest challenges, is because that's such an intense, situation, and law enforcement is trained to use force to take control over a situation. And those interactions don't usually end well. And so we usually see people, deaf people, injured or sometimes killed when they are sometimes unarmed and not and sometimes not even involved in the situation. So there's story after story about deaf people who have been injured and killed when they weren't even the person, the suspect. The police just got confused, and then the deaf person wasn't complying. So I think, to me, if I had to pick one area, I would pick law enforcement, because the stakes are high, and I think we could make a huge difference there.
Makoto or Noel, do you want to add anything?
Makoto.
Well, I hope, after just watching this film again, it touched my heart. It really, Michelle's artwork is beautiful. I thought, wow, I don't see a disability. I see so much potential in order for her to grow as a person, as a human. So my hope is that one day I get to meet her and she can teach me how to paint. And also, I'm hoping that people all over the world, if they meet a deaf person, not to look that something is missing, look and listen, watch, listen to their voice, their actions, open their mind, interact with that person. Don't judge, support that person, empower and work together. And that's how the world and society, that's what I hope for. This is Noel. I agree with what Gabe and Makoto are saying. There's so many things to pick. It's hard to pick just one, so I'm going to pick two. I would encourage people to learn about autism, meaning the community oppressing deaf people and their rights and their needs, and what, as a human, what they need to fully accommodate accessibility. For me now, I'm doing some research for my PhD related to therapy in mental health services. And there's not enough culturally competent therapists to be able to understand and respect a place of cultural exchange and training and collaboration, where they see more people need therapy. Talk therapy is great, but sometimes the language barriers are there and they need to broaden their expressive art therapies. Art therapy, music therapy, dance therapy, the whole gamut for the deaf community. So guaranteed, so that the language will not be deprived, it can have some other expression in their life, because the accessibility is needed for all people.
Yeah, and making this film, I mean, like I said, we've learned so much. The film can be a little overwhelming at first when you watch it, because, as we've all stated, there are so many issues that need to be addressed. But one of my favorite quotes is by a woman, Joanna Macy, and she says that hope is a verb, and that means that every day we each have to enact hope. Hope is not a noun. It's not something we think about. So for us in this film, one of our main goals is to secure the basic human right to communication for deaf and disabled people in the criminal justice system. And we hope that all of you will sign up for our newsletter. Join us in this movement. It's just the beginning. We plan to have regional impact screenings around the country. We want to just have this film be a hub for clinicians and therapists and interpreters and law enforcement, lawmakers, judges, everyone to come together and really find ways to change the system, because it takes each and every one of us becoming a part of what needs to happen.
I usually end with how is the person in the film doing now? And I would like to end like that, but I have one good question here that maybe I'm ignorant of or whatever, but I would like to ask, and maybe there's an answer. Is there any technology sort of that is helping alleviate this problem? I know that subtitles captioning has become infinitely more easy in the last even 2 years. is there anything in the reverse, like services, apps, or anything that help people when they need to interact with somebody who's deaf, like a police officer or anything like that, that would work as translation or as interpreter, like on demand? Is that anything in that realm exists? Or
I'll start out just saying, number one, again, it really depends on who the person is. If it's Michelle, ideally she would have a deaf interpreter and a hearing interpreter, because Michelle can't fluently communicate with a hearing interpreter. It requires a deaf interpreter to make sure that communication is actually happening. So anybody can talk and let someone read and, you know, whatever, but if the communication isn't being understood, it's not communication, right? Mm-hmm. So it kind of depends. There are the video relay services, which actually the FCC just passed. I don't know exactly how to talk about it. Maybe Gabe could know better. They passed something, but basically they're going to try and make sure that video phones are in prisons around the country, which is a huge win for the deaf community, because, you know, we have folks on our team. Dr. May Kennedy, our social impact advisor, her father was in a federal prison for 7.5 years, and he fought the entire time he was there to have access to a video phone so that he could communicate with his family. A hearing person can pick up the phone and have a conversation, but he never could. So actually, that's a huge win. But again, you know, if you know, it just depends on who the person is and if that's actually enabling them to have full communication. So ideally, there need to be more access to interpreters. There is a kind of neat app developed by a deaf person. It's called Cardzilla, Cardzilla. And we use that with our team that does read and write. And, you know, it's kind of neat because you can either speak into it and it types kind of big letters, or you can type into it. And then at the end, after someone's read it, you just shake it and it erases it. So it's kind of a quick way to communicate back and forth. You know, so there are different things, but the main point here is to just figure out how to communicate. It's possible. Another neat story I like to tell is my husband grew up in northern India, and language changes every kilometer, every few kilometers. The dialect changes, the language changes. So he's accustomed to communicating with people across languages. You don't always have to share the same language to communicate. So when he and Michelle met, you see they just have this beautiful way of communicating, even though they don't speak the same language. So anyways, keeping that in mind, it's always possible to figure out how to communicate. Just got to try.
Pat, I want to add to what May said. Like as we've gone through these discussions, my colleagues and I have been talking about why, if teenagers can walk around FaceTime each other, why can't police, you know, access like on an iPad an interpreter on demand? There are in most parts of our country, there are interpreters that are working 24/7 and could potentially be accessed on demand, you know, in a law enforcement situation. Certainly within a few minutes they could be, but we're not quite there yet as far as I'm understanding. But I think that, you know, with the FCC and other law enforcement regulatory organizations, perhaps we will see that, you know, emerge down the road.
Great. Well, that's some hope. And like I said, I'd always like, unless Makoto or Noel want to add anything.
Nope, we're good.
I'd love to hear what's going on with Michelle now.
I think it's all good. Well, I do have suggest ask the deaf person what their preferred mode of communication is, then assuming, and then just have a hearing person decide what's the best way for a deaf person to communicate. It's actually the deaf person who would know their preferred mode of communication, and everyone will agree. Noel says, yes, I fully agree with Makoto. Ask the deaf person. It's not, you know, don't just put a deaf hearing interpreter in. That might not be enough of accommodation. They may say, oh, I sign, but it's not always a perfect fit for accurate communication. And consider the deaf interpreter with that need.
Thank you.
Well, and in terms of how Michelle's doing, she's doing well. She's still on her journey. Right now, her biggest goal is to have a little more independence in her living situation. She's still living in a house that's owned by Kim and, you know, has the support of Kim and Bob, but she really wants to get to a place where she's independent and making most of her own decisions. She's still painting. She loves her cats. She's been able to travel with us to several festivals, and we have hopes of, doing more of that in the future with planned events. She had her first plane ride when she came to the world premiere in Missoula, Montana. She actually flew on the plane home to Florida and she loved it. So she since flew to Cleveland, Ohio, and out to California for another screening. But yeah, she's still on her journey of finding independence and happiness in her life, but she has a strong team. We're trying to support her. It's a little challenging because Florida doesn't have the best services. Different states have different programs that are available and support that's available for someone like Michelle. One of our things we're working on is supplemental educational materials, and we're hoping to include information on different programs around the country. There's some support in different states for people like Michelle who are deaf and have an additional disability. Sadly, there's not enough, and there's got to be more. So anyways.
Thank you, May. So we're out of time. I appreciate everybody coming here and watching the movies with us. I do want to reiterate that we are having a Viewer's Choice Award for the films. Everyone's welcome to vote as many times as they want. And the winner, we give $1,000 to donate to a charity of their choice. There's information on that below the YouTube video, so you just click on that and you can vote. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the film. I hope everybody else did too. I don't know if there's anything anybody wants to say in closing, but you're welcome to. We have another minute or two.
Please do sign up for our newsletter at beingmichelle.com.
I'll add that to the link, to the description for the YouTube as well, so people can click it easier. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Thank you.
Thank you to the Trauma Research Foundation